to our Yaffe Zoom series, which this year is centering around around holidays, around the Chagim as well as other holidays. And this particular session is in advance of Martin Luther King Day coming up, and we invite our friends from Liberty Grace who are joining with us or will be joining with us to join with us. We're happy to have you here. For those who are listening in on the pre-introduction, Rabbi Wahlberg shared with Rabbi Berman how much he meant to Rabbi Wahlberg as a rabbi, and shared words Rabbi Berman wrote in an article in the 70s, that the only thing Rabbi Berman he didn't say is that just a few weeks ago he made copies of that article and gave it to all the rabbis on staff and anyone else he could give it to. So it's still leaving an impact on him, but it tells you something about Rabbi Berman that I would speak in at least as glowing terms as Rabbi Wahlberg did about the impact that he had on him, that he had on me. So Rabbi Wahlberg and I are, let's say, a generation apart as rabbis, 20th century, 41st century. And that's who Rabbi Berman has been to many people and to many rabbis. Really a guiding light, dear mentor and rabbinic hero of mine. And I'm thrilled that he's joining us here this evening. Another thing that he's been has really been, I think, a voice of moral consciousness, certainly in the Orthodox rabbinate, but I would say for Jews and beyond. I would say one of the most important rabbinic voices in the 20th and into the 21st century. And he certainly began some of that work with some of what he's going to share with us this evening. This week's Parshat Shemot, speaks about the beginning of us as a nation, and we see very early on in who Moshe was that it was important for him to go out and be there for the people, for his brothers, but eventually also even those who were not his brothers, those who weren't Jewish, but with the Midianites, and stepping in as a voice of moral consciousness there as well. So in advance of Martin Luther King Day, in a very special evening tonight, a yurtzeit that Rabbi Berman will speak about, and with the Parsha of the week, it certainly feels very, very appropriate to be hosting this Zoom series this evening. Rabbi Berman teaches Judaic studies at Stern College and teaches Talmudic law at Columbia University. He was a rabbi in Berkeley. He was a rabbi in Lincoln Square Synagogue. And he's lectured widely, written articles widely, not written enough books for some of our liking, but you can find a lot of great stuff out there. I don't know if they still have out there the videos that you used to do on Parsha of the Week, which were unbelievable. But we are honored, really honored, deeply honored, and privileged that he's joining us for any topic of discussion, but particularly for the topic of discussion that he's going to share in a very personal way this evening. We're very, very, very fortunate. There will be opportunity at the end for questions and answers, but I'll ask that you please message me directly in the chat with the question, and I'll collect them throughout and ask them at the end. So again, please just message me directly. And not just am I asking, but Rabbi Berman specifically asked he would appreciate as many faces as he could see. So unless you're in a situation where we should not be seeing what you are doing, we would ask that you turn on your cameras, keep yourselves on mute, but turn on your cameras, because it's much more enjoyable. He said he'd like to be able to see and to experience like we're here. Well, thank you all so much for doing that so quickly. Appreciate it. It's a distinct honor and privilege to have Rabbi Berman join us this evening. Rabbi Berman, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your kind words, Rabbi Posner, and thank you, Rabbi Wahlberg, and thank you, Chana, for having coordinated my visit with your community in this particular way. As Rabbi Posner indicated, tonight is also aside being just 3 days before Martin Luther King Day, which makes our discussion of of my experiences in Selma in 1965 appropriate. Tonight was the beginning of the 50th yahrzeit of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Rabbi Heschel, as I'm sure you're all aware, was a really significant figure in the American civil rights movement. Was very close with Martin Luther King, and Rabbi Heschel's daughter has shared with me and with others many of the experiences that Rabbi Heschel and Martin Luther King had shared, and what they meant to him. Rabbi Heschel had a profound influence on me in the early 1960s when I was rabbi at an Orthodox congregation in Berkeley, California, and Rabbi Heschel used to come to the campus at UC Berkeley usually once to twice a year, and I would have the opportunity to meet with him then and then later on as well. And he was in many ways a paradigm of a sense of Jewish responsibility for the society within which we live. And I'll have more to say about that later on, but I think it's sort of appropriate to acknowledge that this is his 50th yahrzeit. So what I would like to do is to share with you, first of all, some of the background to my own visit to Selma in 1965. In that decade, from 1965 until 1965, there were approximately between 50 and 100 people who were murdered because of their involvement in civil rights activities. Beginning already in 1960, in 1955, when Reverend George Lee, a Mississippi minister, was murdered because he was using his pulpit as a way of promoting political engagement and voting rights efforts on behalf of Blacks in the South. Thereafter, some names that you would know even, Emmett Till, and also in 1955, Medgar Evers was killed in 1963. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, who were murdered in 1964, and their bodies buried in a place where it was expected they would never be found. And then just, you know, all of these people are memorialized at the Southern Poverty Law Center, at a civil rights memorial, but people are not conscious of the degree of violence that existed in the country around the issue of civil rights. Civil rights was not just a political question, it was not just a matter of academic debate, and it was not even just a matter of sort of social conflict in various communities. But it was a source of quite extraordinary violence. So that when in 1963, August 28th in 1963, when Martin Luther King, in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, acknowledged that there were lots of people who thought that already by that time that enough had been done to provide equal rights to Blacks. And people were calling on him to desist from any further public demonstrations or anything else that would disrupt the peace of communities in the South. Martin Luther King said the following, and I think it's worth hearing his words. He said, "There are those who are asking devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied?" And his answer, "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. So his initial response is that we can't be satisfied so long as our lives are being threatened, our health is being undermined, our social acceptability is being denied. And then he continued, we cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility from a smaller ghetto is to a larger one, that is the economic vulnerability of Blacks at that time, and as well now. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. That is, he recognized not only the significance of threats to life and vulnerability of health and social and economic denial, but likewise the economic vulnerability of the generational continuity of poverty, and people's denial of their selfhood and their human dignity. And he then says, we cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote, and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. So that is the denial of the right to political engagement. No, he says, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. That is, that all of these are domains of vulnerability of the Black community, which existed in the 1960s, and in many ways continue to exist to this day. And I'll have more to say about that a little bit, later on. But we as Jews, of course, needed to be able to resonate with the realization that threats to people who are vulnerable in societies in which we live ought not to be acceptable to us. He spoke those words, as I said, in August of 1963, a month later, at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. A bomb exploded and killed 4 young Blacks. Another piece of this process of more and more people being killed, because in that instance, the church was a center of voting rights activities. And even in the period immediately preceding my own visit to Selma in February, early February, mid-February of 1965, Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed. Those of you who saw the movie Selma might remember the scenes of Jimmy Lee Jackson being murdered by a police officer as he was attempting to use methods of passive resistance, just protect his mother from being beaten with the baton that the officer was wielding against her. And then just a few days before I and a group of other rabbis arrived in Selma on March 11th of 1965, Reverend James Reeb, who was a Unitarian minister from Boston, was beaten to death in the streets of Selma after emerging from a bar and being followed down the street and being attacked because people knew that he had come to participate in voting rights activities. So that was a reality. And it was soon, right around that time, after all, Sunday, March 7th was Bloody Sunday. It was the day on which the attempt of approximately 600 people to cross the Edmund Peters Bridge in Selma to engage in a march to Montgomery in protest against the deprivation of voting rights was violently beaten back, but was broadcast all over the country by television. It was at that time, in the week just before and the week after Bloody Sunday, that Martin Luther King issued a call to clergy all over the United States to come to Selma, to participate in voting rights efforts, and then to be a participant in what he had planned at that point to be a march from Selma to Montgomery, which he thought would involve tens of thousands of people. And so in response to that invitation, a group of 5 of us from Northern California, 3 Reform rabbis and 1 conservative rabbi, and myself, I then constituted 20% of the entire Orthodox rabbinate of Northern California. And so I very often proudly say to people, oh, you don't think there was great Orthodox participation? 20% of the Orthodox rabbinate of the whole of Northern California went to Selma in 1965. So that was me. We flew out of Oakland, actually, on a flight to Montgomery. And there we were met and transported from Montgomery to Selma to participate in voting rights, initially in efforts at enabling Blacks to vote. Again, those of you who saw the movie Selma will remember the scene in which Oprah, having spent months preparing for the test that she would be given on American history and constitutional law, found herself confronted by a pakid behind a screen who said, after her answering all of the questions correctly, he pulled down the screen and said, sorry, we have to close now, but refused to enable her to actually register to vote. That was happening systematically in the South. People were simply being denied beyond anything that the law allowed, beyond anything that any actual regulations allowed. Blacks were being denied the opportunity to register to vote. And so we were attempting to impact on that picture. So, and it was during the trip actually from Montgomery to Selma that I and one of the other rabbis from Berkeley were being driven by an uncle of Jimmy Lee Jackson, who just less than 3 weeks earlier had been murdered by a police officer. We did not know at the time that at his funeral, one of the ministers actually quoted the book of Esther. I'll come back to that again later as well. And he described to us in more detail than we had previously been able to have the details of the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson. We arrived in Selma, and we were told that we need to go to a briefing on how to engage in civil disobedience, in passive disobedience. But before we had an opportunity to do that training, we were called to participate in a demonstration in front of the mayor's home. And so approximately 150 people sort of gathered at Brown's Chapel, which was the central location in which most of the organizing related to these demonstrations was taking place. And we sort of spread out and entered the white neighborhoods of Selma from various streets, from different access points, and then met in front of the home of the new young mayor of Selma, who many thought at the time would bring a very different kind of attitude toward Black participation in the political process. Mayor Smitherman, actually, that was his first term of office. He had just been elected in 1964. He was voted out of office in September 2000. That is, he remained the mayor of Selma for 36 years. We were demonstrating out in front of his home. We gathered in front of the house, and we then pulled out from under our jackets so large banners and signs calling on him to modify the way in which the voting right to vote was being withheld from Black citizens. Within minutes after our arrival there, we were surrounded by police officers who told us that we were in violation of a public ordinance of Selma, which forbade any form of public demonstrations in the white neighborhoods of Selma. That was actually the language of the ordinance. They told us that we have to disband immediately and leave, or else we would be put under arrest. We said that we were not going to leave. They had already brought buses, and when we told them that we were not going to leave, they loaded us onto buses and took us to the police station to put us under arrest. During that ride, that short ride from Mayor Smitherman's home to the police station, we began to feel more directly some of this sort of atmosphere of violence that was current at the time, in the sense that when we entered the buses, they announced at the beginning that there will be no talking, no conversations allowed during this entire trip. And there were 3 police officers, one at the back of the bus, one in the middle of the bus, one at the front of the bus. I was sitting sort of right close to where the officer in the middle of the bus was standing, and he looked like a very, normal, kind person. And I sort of looked up at him at one point and I said, I'm sure that you really don't want to be doing this. And he swung his baton. I'm sure that he planned to miss me, but I could feel the air rush by next to my ear as he swung it just past my head into the back of the seat in front of me, literally causing that person to be bounced out of his seat. And he said to me, I would rather burn in hell than have to listen to your expletives deleted. They brought us to the police station. They kept us standing for a long period of time, and then they didn't have enough cell space for us. And so they put us into a large holding room. There were about 150 of us, and they just kept us there. There was nothing no food, no drink. That was particularly problematic for me because that day, the day of our arrival in Selma, was actually Tanit Esther. It was the fast of Esther. And so I had not eaten anything from sort of early in that dawn until late that afternoon. And, but I figured, okay, I can manage, but nobody else had anything to eat either, and nobody had anything to drink either. So, I was there together with everybody else. We were being held. We were being told that we were being held for booking, and that after we'd be booked, they would decide what to do with us. There were all sorts of discussions that were going on amongst the people who were being held there. What I did not know at that moment was something that was going on outside this space. And suddenly an officer came into the room. By then it was about 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night, and it was dark for a long period of time already. An officer came into the room and said, "Is there a Rabbi Berman here?" So I was not particularly anxious to identify myself. And after all, there could have been another Rabbi Berman there who might have been willing to do so. I sort of sat still in my place, and the officer began sort of walking through this crowd of people. And then he saw me and he saw my kippah, which it was just like this one. It was a black knitted kippah. It was not, not one of the silk ones that many people were wearing. I'll tell you about that later also. And he turned to me and he said, are you Rabbi Berman? And so I was not going to deny it. I said, yes. So he said, you come out with me. So I said, okay, not knowing what I would meet up with until I got outside. What I had not known was that one of my colleagues from Northern California was aware that I had been fasting. He arrived on the same flight, but at a later time, and he found out that we had been arrested, and he knew that I was fasting. He assumed that I would have brought along some food for myself. So he tracked down my bags, which had been placed in the home of a Black family where I was going to be staying. And he searched through my knapsack, and he found two long tubes. So one of them was a long salami wrapped in a brown paper bag. And the other one was my father's Megillah, which he had given me to take with me when I became rabbi at Berkeley. And I had taken with me, recognizing I would need to read the Megillah in prison. Not in prison, I recognized I have to do that in Selma. And he found both of them. And so he took the two of them and sort of in total innocence went walking through the whole of the white neighborhood in Selma with these two tubular objects under his arm, and found the prison, and was jumped by the police as soon as he appeared, because who knew what he was carrying in those tubes. He managed to persuade them that they were not bombs or anything like that, and they were willing to open up. He said that when there's a rabbi in there who hasn't eaten anything because it's a Jewish fast day, and that this is some food, a salami for him, and his Megillah, he tried to scroll. They opened the scroll to check that it really was only, they didn't cut into the salami, as far as I know. But in any case, so he was there. They agreed to let him give me these two things. So I had it, and with the arrival of the Megillah, I and a number of other rabbis who were present decided that we should read the Megillah to this gathering of 150 people or so. And so we sort of created a service for Purim there in the prison. It turned out that when we announced that we were going to be doing this, it turned out that about half of the young people who were there, who had come from all over the country to participate in these civil rights activities, about half of them were Jewish. Most of them had no particularly strong Jewish identification, but they knew that they were Jewish. And so when we said that we were going to conduct a service and read from the Megillah, they particularly came forward to participate. And so we explained what the Megillah is and its background, and we read part of it, and then I went off into a corner with just one other person and read the entire Megillah, and then was able to have something to eat. That discovery was very important to me. It reminded me at the time of a teaching that I had heard in the name of Rabbi Cook. Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, the first chief rabbi of Palestine under the British Mandate. Rabbi Cook had taught at one point that there are actually two forms of sort of rebellion against Torah. What he referred to as a chutzpah, sort of rejection, rebellion and rejection against Torah. He said there is chutzpah tata'ah, there's a lower form of rebellion, and there's a chutzpah ila'ah, and there's a higher form of rebellion. The lower form of rebellion, he said, is when people can't resist the temptations of doing that which is forbidden by the Torah. And in their inability to resist those temptations, they breach the will of Torah because self-gratification is more important to them than the principles of Torah. He said that's a lower form of rebellion. On the other hand, he said, there's chutzpah ila'ah, there's a higher form of rebellion. The higher form of rebellion is when young people, he said, do not discover in Torah the standards of ethics and spirituality that they are seeking. And that, he said, is a higher form of rebellion because that's not their fault. He said, that's our fault. That's the fault of those who are the adherents of Torah and the teachers of Torah, that we have not been able to convey to young people with sufficient power the grandeur of the spirituality and the ethics of Torah, to convey to them that they will find that better in Torah than in any other search that they pursue. And what I saw at that point was in part that kind of drive, a profoundly Jewish ethical and spiritual drive that were leading these young people to believe that they needed to put themselves in situations of danger in order to achieve higher ethical standards in their lives, in order to achieve a kind of consciousness of the presence of God in their lives that would be meaningful to them. Later that evening, I was sitting with another rabbi, actually another colleague from Berkeley, a Reform rabbi. And again, a police officer entered the room and said, "Is there a Rabbi Gumbiner here?" The name may be familiar to some of you. Rabbi Abraham Gumbiner in the 17th century, in the 1600s, one of the Magen Avraham, one of the leading commentators to the Shulchan Aruch. This Rabbi Jacob Gumbiner was the rabbi of the Hillel Foundation in Berkeley and was a direct descendant on the male line of Rabbi Abraham Gumbiner. So this police officer comes in and he says, "Is there a Rabbi Gumbiner here?" Rabbi Gumbiner turns to me and says, "Don't tell them I'm here." It was not until later, I'll tell you how much later in a moment, that he revealed to us that when he first graduated Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, 25 years earlier, his first pulpit was in Selma, Alabama. And he, for approximately 5 years, had been the rabbi of the Reform Temple in Selma, Alabama. It turned out that there was someone who had seen his name amongst the list, because they had taken our names, they hadn't completed our booking, but they had taken our names, and someone had seen his name and remembered that there had been a Gumbiner as rabbi of the congregation, and the leaders of the Jewish community of Selma wanted to meet with him. In any case, this police officer came in, and again, he's sort of floating around looking for Rabbi Gumbiner, and he recognized me already from the previous visit, and then he saw this other man sitting next to me who was wearing a kippah, and he said, "Are you Rabbi Gumbiner?" And Rabbi Gumbiner said, "Yes." Said the police officer, "You'll come out with me." And Rabbi Gumbiner said, "No, I'm not going anyplace." And the officer said, "Well, you're coming out with me. The only question is whether you're walking on your feet or you're going to be dragged out by your feet. But you're coming out, so you might as well just come." At which point Rabbi Gumbiner said, "I'm not going alone." So I said I would go with him. And then another person on the other side of him said, "You come." And the three of us went out. And there we met representatives of the Jewish community of Selma. And they had come to meet with Rabbi Gumbiner. They met with the three of us. And after some small talk, they gave us a small office and we sat there, the six of us. The representatives of the Jewish community in Selma said to us that they appreciate, they understand that we are doing what we're doing out of righteous motives, but they wanted us to understand that we are injuring them and that we have to leave. How are we injuring them? Well, they said, most of them are store owners. They're retail in various areas. And the blacks in the entire area were conducting a boycott of white-owned stores. So to begin with, they had lost all of the business they had previously been able to do with the black community. But not only that, they said, but because of the prominence of Jews in the civil rights activities in the area, their white neighbors, their white Christian neighbors, were also not coming to their stores and had severed their social relationships to them as well. And so they said, listen, you may be trying to help these other people, these black people, but don't you have a responsibility to us also, because you are causing injury to us. It was a very lengthy and complicated conversation that we had with them. I'll tell you the essence of what we said to them, our response to them. Our response to them was, it's 1965. It's 20 years since the end of the Holocaust. We, the Jewish people, have been telling the Christian communities of virtually every European country that responsible for the Holocaust were not only Hitler and not only the SS and not only the Nazi Party. Responsible for the Holocaust, the responsibility for the Holocaust was also shared by all of those good Christians who in the early 1930s, when Hitler's plans for the Jews first began to be manifest, when they failed to stand up for the Jews at a point at which for them it would only have meant some slight economic or social dislocation. Just as the Pope, right, Pius XII, impious XII, was telling Catholic priests that they should not, in that period of time, that they should not stand up and speak on behalf of Jews because it would create a disadvantage for Catholics in predominantly Protestant countries in Eastern and in Western Europe. So we said to our co-religionists, we are sympathetic to your plight. If there's anything that we can do to help you economically, we will be glad to go back and speak to Jewish organizations and try to see to it that you be helped economically, and that if you can't make it here any longer because of the economic and social conditions, to help you resettle elsewhere in the United States. But what is it that you want us to be telling the rest of the Christian population of Europe and the United States? That when Christians oppress Jews, that good Christians have a responsibility to intercede and attempt to protect Jews, even though it may cost them something economically and socially. But that when Christians oppress Black citizens in the United States, that Jewish citizens should refrain from standing up for the Black vulnerable population because we have to be able to protect the economic and social condition of Jews? Really? Is that what you want us to tell the world? So you can well imagine that this did not sit well with them, and the conversations were not pleasant. We parted, not friendly, but we parted as Jews. We at least hugged each other. I want to move on to another experience that I had. There was a second time that I was arrested. That first time, they eventually, the next morning, they actually let us out of prison, and they did not end up actually booking us. But the next day, there were further demonstrations. The day after, there were again activities related to voting rights, and then on Friday of that week, this is the Friday before the march from Selma to Montgomery, there was a major demonstration again in front of the home of Mayor Smitherman. Again, I and a number of my colleagues were there. And the same thing happened. We were all arrested. This time there were about 250 people there, significant number of Blacks, local Blacks, a significant number of young Jews and young people from all over the United States, and a group of Protestant clergy. There were no Catholics because the bishops in the area in the South had forbidden Catholic priests from participating in civil rights activities. Occasionally, there were Catholic priests from other dioceses and from other parts of the country who came to participate in these events. On that particular occasion, there weren't any. We were all arrested. Again, we were brought to prison. This time they had to find an even larger room to put us into. and they told us that they were going to book us later that evening. This time they had kept us standing outside for about 3 hours before they brought us inside and allowed people to use the restrooms. Um, uh, um, and there was lots of people just sitting around talking. Shabbat began. It was Friday night. So I did what I could do for Shabbat. I was able to daven. We actually conducted a brief Friday night service. And again, huge number of young Jews suddenly came out of this mass group to at least be present, if not to actually participate. And many others just joined in order to see what this was going to be about. We did an abbreviated sort of service, and then I made Kiddush. I mean, I could not, there was no wine for me to drink. There was no bread for me to make motzi on. But after all, the Doraita obligation of Kiddush is simply the verbal affirmation of the holiness of Shabbat. And in that particular setting, to make reference to Yetziat Mitzrayim, to make reference to the Exodus, which was particularly powerful for the Black community throughout the South. The model of the Exodus in the Bible was a powerful force for them. One of the reasons that the wearing of yarmulkes had become so popular in the Selma area, we had actually been asked to bring boxes of black silk yarmulkes, you know, the old synagogue type yarmulkes, to bring them because Black people wanted to sort of connect to that component of the Bible, of the narrative of the Exodus, as sort of as if they were the Jewish people just attempting to escape slavery. There was a practical reason for it as well. There was one minister who actually started that practice, who, when asked why he was wearing a kippah, said, you know, when the police officers look at me, all they see is a Black man. But when they see me with a kippah on, they say, wait, maybe he's Jewish. And that gives them pause. And therefore, that reduces the likelihood that they're going to act violently toward me. In any case, we were there late that night. Someone came into the room in which we were being held and asked for the clergy to come out because the head of public safety, the equivalent of the police chief in Berkeley, Mr. Baker, wanted to meet with us. So we all came out. There were about 40 of us, there were about 40 clergymen in this group. We came out and we were brought into a room where we could actually sit on chairs. And Mr. Baker began to speak with us. And his message to us was not that dissimilar, although in one component it was radically different, from the message that we had heard from our Jewish compatriots, our fellow Jews, a few nights before. Mr. Baker said, listen, he understands that we are all here for spiritual purpose and to help people achieve liberty and to help them achieve rights to vote and things of that sort. He said it's all very important and he respects that we are attempting to do that, he said. But let me tell you something. I'm going to be booking all of you, all 250 of you, I'm going to be booking you all, later tonight. And for most of you, after you're booked, you'll be released on your own recognizance, and you may eventually have to pay a fine, but that's about it. But there are approximately 50 young Blacks in this group. He says, I know many of them because they're local. They're from Selma. And for them, being booked for engaging in a public demonstration, and as I will do, book them also for resisting arrest. When I do that, their entire futures will be wiped out. They will not be admitted to any school that they want to go to in the South. They will not be able to get jobs. If they're hired, they'll be hired only for the most menial of work and will never be promoted. So I'm telling you as follows. If you want to help these 50 young men, then accept my offer, which is that if you agree that you will all leave Selma by tomorrow morning, and before that march begins on Sunday, then I will not book anyone in this entire gathering. And if you refuse to go, I will book you all, and you will then bear the responsibility for the ruination of the lives of these 50 young men. So he said, so what do you say? So our response was, we need some time to think about this. It sounds to us like a serious moral dilemma for us, and we need to talk about it. So he said, okay, talk about it. And whenever you arrive at a decision, you call and let me know, but you have to know exactly what the consequences will be. So we went out, the 40 of us, and we sort of appropriated a corner of the room, and we began discussing what to do about this situation, because after all, this was a serious dilemma. Well, it did not take long for what it was that we were discussing to leak out of our group of 40 or so. And then a striking thing happened. For all of the younger whites and for the older white people in the group, and for the older Black people in the group, it seemed perfectly reasonable to have 40 clergymen sit in a corner of the room, contend with this ethical dilemma, and decide whether they should stay or they should leave. And that, in turn, everybody else would then accept their decision. But for the younger Blacks in the room, it was clear that that was not right. And they began to be very vocal about that. And they said, listen, we're not slaves anymore. You know, if the concern here is our future, then we need to have a voice in this. We're entitled to a voice in this. We're entitled to say whether we're willing to suffer the consequences in order to assure that this process of demonstration and civil rights activity can continue in order to benefit the Black community as a whole. You don't have the right to make that decision for us. It became clear very rapidly that once they had made the